Sir William Patey, former head of the Middle East Department at the Foreign Office, former British ambassador, of course, to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Sudan and Afghanistan. So hardly a better person to talk to for expertise on that part of the world. Sir William, thanks so much for joining us this morning. When you look at the reports emerging from Iran, and of course some of them are a bit sketchy because the internet has been taken down there, but when you look at the reports that are coming out and how ubiquitous these protests seems to be, do you think there is a possibility that we are on the verge of a revolution in Iran?
Well, it's difficult to say. We've been here before with large demonstrations in 22 in the Women's Network. These seem to be more significant, more sustained, and seem to be stemming from economic causes. So those of us who are old enough to remember the Shah fell when the bazaar, the commercial people, aligned with more mass forces and overthrew the Shah. So the forces against the regime are pretty strong, but the regime hasn't lost its power to repress, and we're seeing that. The IRGC, they seem to have tried to shut down the internet in order to freely attack people. There are snipers on the streets. There are reports of dozens of Iranians being killed. That doesn't appear to have deterred the Iranians. So it does feel like that moment, but we've been here before, so it's hard to say. And there is no obvious alternative on leadership. This is a mass protests all over Iran, but without any recognised leadership or a sense of alternative. And that's when you have a revolution. Usually, one of the conditions is there needs to be some alternative ready.
Do you think that Donald Trump has threatened that if the regime in Iran uses violence or uses sustained violence against the protesters, against those demonstrating, Trump has threatened to use military force himself against the regime? Do you think that that would be helpful, counterproductive, or even decisive?
I doubt it would be decisive. My experience in Iraq and Afghanistan has taught me that there are limits to air power making changes on the ground. The sorts of things he could do would be to target IRGC headquarters, punish them for repression, punish them for using military force against the regime, but that wouldn't create a new regime. It would certainly, the Iranians are looking for US support, but I doubt it would be decisive. In the end, if the Ayatollah Khamenei remains with people around him thinking that they can still win, it'll boil down to how much repression they're prepared to use. How Assad survived for 10 years by being willing to be very brutal against his own people. It took quite a lot of efforts to get rid of him, and he was only deposed by force in the end by Syrians. So the same is probably true of Iran, but you never see the tipping point until it comes. In 79 we had a failure of imagination. We failed to see how the Shah would fall. So we do appear to be on a tipping point, but as I say, we won't know until it happens. I doubt the American intervention would be decisive.
Would you think that in terms of how the British government should be responding to this, do you think that if that American intervention did come, is it something that we should support?
Well, you mean support physically or support politically? Politically, the Iranian regime deserves no one's support, and it certainly doesn't have the support of the people. So I wouldn't put it top of my list of condemning or critique. There are many other things to be critiquing the Americans about. Taking military action in defence of civilian protests in Iran will be way down my list of criticisms of them. I doubt we'll get involved directly. We are on the sidelines. We're doing what we can, which is to say military force against peaceful demonstrators is unacceptable. I'd support the Iranians in their desire for greater democracy and an end to this regime, but it's moral support. There's not much more we can do.
Do you think that we should fear the threats of retaliation that they're making at the moment to the US and Israel if that intervention were to come?
I suspect it's more bluster than reality, because the Iranians know that would produce an even greater response. It's not impossible that Iranian-backed terrorist groups are active and able to attack Israeli or American targets in the Gulf. But Iran's power in the region has been severely diminished. Its proxies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, have been severely weakened. It can no longer rely on Syria to help them. And the Houthis in Yemen are already attacking and have their own problems. So you can't rule it out, but I think it's more bluster than reality.
And just finally, Sir William, as someone who knows foreign affairs extremely well, Foreign Office extremely well, have seen your share of American administrations come and go, do you think that it is being reported this morning that the Trump administration has asked the US military to draw up detailed plans for a Greenlandic invasion? Is that something do you think we should take seriously?
Yes, I think given the renewed statements, we thought it was all bluster and an attempt to sort of divert attention. I think we should take it seriously, given the amount of time the number of people in the US administration are speaking about it. They don't need, of course. There's nowhere to invade. I mean, there's no defence force to speak of in Greenland. The only military in Greenland are the Americans. I suppose the big issue for Britain and for European members of NATO is to convince Americans that they can achieve all the objectives they've talked about in terms of defence through NATO. They can reinforce NATO. There used to be 17 American bases in Greenland. It's America that closed them and reduced them down to one. The Danes have said already they can increase their security forces. That could be a combined NATO organisation, but then you have to ask yourself whether it's more than just about the security of NATO or the security of the United States, and it's more about Donald Trump's legacy, his access to minerals in Greenland. So I think an invasion against the wishes of NATO would be the end of NATO and have very profound consequences for European defence. 570
protests now reported across Iran. The regime has said that anyone who takes part in those protests will be considered an enemy of God, a charge which carries the death penalty. What would your message be to the Ayatollah and the rest of his government this morning?
Well, the message of the British government to the authorities in Tehran is you've got to exercise restraint here. People have a right to peaceful protest. They need to protect the lives of their citizens. There are some pretty fundamental human freedoms here at stake. Right to protest is one of them. Right to access information and be able to communicate. We're seeing pretty much a news blackout. And so it's a pretty unstable and fast-moving situation there. It's clearly been a repressive regime. We've long viewed it to be a hostile state with security implications, not just for the region, but also other parts of the world. And so it's clearly quite a tense situation there.
Do we support the protesters? I mean, what's the British government's message to them?
So, look, as I say, it's pretty fast moving. And, when you consider what the population of Iran has been subject to, you can understand why they are making their voice known. There's huge economic difficulties in the country at the moment.
Huge human rights violations.
Huge human rights violations as well. And so this is a really very serious situation.
Donald Trump
monitoring it very closely.
Donald Trump has said quite clearly that he's considering military action if the regime continues to use violence against their citizens. Is that something we'd support?
Sorry, just repeat that question, Lewis.
As in, Donald Trump has said that he will attack the Iranian regime if they continue to use violence against their own citizens. Is that something, that military action, something we'd support?
So that's a hypothetical scenario.
Trump's been very clear he will.
Yeah, and I'm not going to provide a running commentary on the foreign policy objectives or military planning of another country.
But I just wonder if we think military action in that regard would be a good idea.
So, look, I think that the most ideal situation is that there is a peaceful resolution to the protests that are underway, that no further lives are lost, no more blood is spilled, but the wishes of the Iranian people are ultimately fulfilled. I don't think any leader of any country would say that they want to first rush to reach for military action. And so we'll be keeping a very close eye on the situation.
I wonder why it is that your government, of course, famously prescribed Palestine action when you haven't prescribed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in this country.
So we have actually, we did ask the independent reviewer of terrorism to look into the powers that the government have available to prescribe organisations that are backed by other states. And he did find some gaps in the legislation, and we will take action to resolve that problem.
It's just that one was a protest group which conducted some direct action against what they believed and many others have described as a genocide in Gaza. Yet the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the leadership of a despotic regime which has a presence in this country and is accused of funding terrorist groups in this country like Hamas, Hezbollah, direct involvement in assassinations, 15 kidnapping attempts in the UK, cyber attacks, supporting radicalisation, that one's allowed. But Palestine action isn't allowed.
Yeah, well, as I say, the independent review that we got Jonathan Hall, KC, to do did say that there were some gaps in the legislation, and we agree with him about that.
You've had 18 months to update that gap.
Look, I'm sure this is one of the things that's top of the list for the new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, to be looking at. And I know that she keeps under very close review prescription of terrorist organisations.
The US, Canada, Sweden, all have prescribed the IRGC,
yeah, look,
but the UK reasonably sanguine so far to
we're not prepared
to exist.
We are not prepared to tolerate malign activity from actors that are backed by hostile states.
Well, you clearly are Secretary of State because they've been allowed to continue.
No, that's why this government commissioned the independent reviewer of terrorism to do that piece of work. That work has now concluded. They have said that there were gaps in the legislative powers, which make it more complicated, and it makes the prescription of an organisation like Palestine Action compared to the prescription of an organisation like the IRGC more complicated. We think that there are gaps
just
in legislation.
Just easier to lock up British
so,
citizens for supporting that particular organisation, and harder to prescribe.
Well, there's
the
a very
Iranian
there's a very thorough process that the Home Secretary will go through before they take any decision, Lewis, to prescribe any organisation. And the evidence that was available about the activities of Palestine Action, some of the court cases that certainly were live a couple of months ago. I'm not sure whether they've reached a conclusion, but there was very significant activity from Palestine Action that led to the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper at the time, taking the decision rightly, in my view, to prescribe that organisation.